April 14, 1945. The war in Europe was gasping its final breaths. Yet halfway across the world, in the high plains of New Mexico, the air was crisp and heavy with the scent of thawing earth. At Camp Drayson, a small prisoner of war camp surrounded by open cattle country, the evening sun painted everything gold: the barbed wire fences, the corrugated rooftops, the faces of 42 German women eating their meager supper of soup and coarse bread. They wore faded, gray uniforms that no longer held shape or pride, the remnants of the Luftwaffe women's auxiliary they had served in before capture. Among them sat Helene Vogt, a 25-year-old from Bremen, once a radio operator who spent her days sending out coded transmissions to units that no longer existed. She ate slowly, her thoughts elsewhere, on the last letter from her mother, on the sound of the North Sea, on the home she wasn't sure still stood. The mess hall door burst open with a slap of cold air. Conversation died instantly. Captain Eleanor Brooks entered, her uniform immaculate, followed by a tall man in dusty jeans, boots, and a weathered cowboy hat, an unusual sight in this world of khaki and formality. He looked uneasy, turning the hat in his hands as Captain Brooks called for attention. The women rose in practiced unison, their movements sharp despite months of captivity. "Ladies," Brooks said, her tone formal but not unkind, "this is Mr. Samuel Whitaker, owner of the Double W Ranch, 5 miles east of here." The man nodded awkwardly, his sun-browned face breaking into a hesitant smile. "My wife Clara and I thought," he began, his accent broad and unpolished, "you ladies might like a proper meal, a Sunday dinner. Nothing fancy, just good food and company." For a moment no one breathed. A home-cooked meal, outside the wire. It sounded like something from before the war, before hunger and fear had become constants. Captain Brooks continued, 20 of you will be chosen, based on conduct and work records. You'll be transported Sunday morning and returned that evening." Her voice carried no emotion, but the shock it caused rippled through the room like electricity. That night, in the barracks, the air hummed with whispers. "Did you see how he invited us?" murmured Clara Weiss, a 32-year-old former clerk. "It sounded ceremonial." Helene tilted her head, curious. "You think it's a wedding?" Clara nodded. The way he spoke, the mention of his wife. Sunday dinner, it must be for a celebration, it made sense. Why else would Americans invite enemy prisoners into their homes? A wedding explained everything, the formality, the timing, the invitation itself. The rumor spread through the compound like wildfire, transforming fear into nervous excitement. By morning, the camp buzzed with energy unseen in months. Even those not selected helped the chosen prepare. With only 4 days until Sunday, every scrap of cloth, every hidden comb, every surviving dab of lipstick became precious. Helene sat on her bunk while Annika Weber, a seamstress from Cologne, adjusted the hem of her faded civilian dress. "If I let it out just a little," Annika said softly, "it will hang better. Look, more elegant." Around them, women mended, shared, and borrowed. A cracked compact mirror was passed hand to hand. A single lipstick, dulled to a stub, was rationed among 6 of them. Clara, practical and motherly, formed what she called the gift committee. "We cannot go to a wedding empty-handed," she insisted, voice firm as she organized the others. "It would shame us as guests." The question that followed hung heavy in the air. What could prisoners possibly give? Helene hesitated, then spoke. "My grandmother taught me embroidery," she said quietly. "If we can find thread and cloth, I can make something small, a keepsake." Help came from an unexpected source. Sergeant May Chen, the camp's supply officer, a middle-aged woman known for her quiet sympathy, listened to their request without a word. Then she disappeared into the storage shed and returned with several squares of white cotton and 2 spools of thread. One white, one sky blue. "I don't know what you're planning," Chen said, smiling faintly, "but needlework isn't against regulations." Her eyes glimmered with understanding. Over the next 3 nights, Helene stitched by the weak light of a single bulb. Her fingers moved slowly, creating delicate pattern, 2 intertwined rings surrounded by tiny flowers. Annika helped plan the design, whispering color choices and small corrections. When Helene's hands trembled from exhaustion, others took over, adding careful stitches of their own. Meanwhile, Lotte Schneider, once a baker's daughter from Frankfurt, found a way to make her own contribution. She began saving small portions of her bread ration, trading with others until she gathered enough flour and sugar to bake a few cookies. The kitchen staff, amused but kind, allowed her to use the ovens late one evening. By the time Sunday dawned, the preparations were complete. The sky stretched wide and clean above the camp, the mountains distant and pale. The 20 chosen women gathered at the gate, dressed in a strange blend of uniforms and patched civilian clothes, their faces scrubbed, hair neatly tied, hearts pounding. Helene wore her cleanest auxiliary jacket with a white collar she had washed 3 times. Annika's hair was arranged into a bun, pinned with borrowed clips. Helene's embroidered handkerchief, their collective gift, was wrapped in brown paper, tied with a piece of string that Clara had somehow made decorative. Lotte carried her tin of cookies wrapped in a napkin. When the trucks arrived, the American soldiers couldn't hide their surprise. "You ladies look like you're headed to a wedding," joked Private Harris, a red-headed Texan barely 20. "Guess Mr. Whitaker throws one fancy Sunday dinner." The women smiled shyly, not correcting him. Their silence said it all. They believed it too. As the trucks rumbled through the countryside, the women pressed close to the wooden sides, staring out at the vastness of America. The open plains rolled endlessly toward the horizon, dotted with horses and cattle grazing under the morning sun. Every farmhouse they passed looked like a miracle, solid, unbroken, untouched by war. Helene watched in silence, a lump forming in her throat. The scale of it all, and the land, the calm, the abundance was overwhelming. Back in Europe, everything was dust and hunger. Here, even the wind seemed alive with peace. And somewhere deep within her, she began to wonder, what kind of people invited their enemies to dinner? Even before the war, the W Ranch must have seemed enormous. As the trucks climbed the final hill, the women inside caught sight of a sweeping valley spread beneath them. A white 2-story farmhouse with a wide porch, barns standing, straight and freshly painted, corrals lined with horses shifting lazily in the sun. Smoke curled from a kitchen chimney, and the smell of roasting meat drifted faintly on the wind. The vehicles came to a halt in a swirl of pale dust. The prisoners fell silent. For the first time since capture, the world before them looked peaceful, almost welcoming. Helene Vogt pressed her palm to the window slat, watching a group of Americans gather near the porch. Men in clean work shirts, boots polished by dust and habit, cowboy hats held respectfully in hand. They looked nothing like soldiers. They looked like home builders. When the truck doors clanged open, sunlight spilled in. A woman stepped forward, silver hair pinned in a neat bun, her lined face softened by an easy smile. "Welcome, ladies," she said in careful English. "I'm Clara Whitaker. We're so happy you could join us today." Her husband Samuel tipped his hat beside her. "Please don't just stand there in that dust. Come on out, dinner's waiting." The German women climbed down one by one, their shoes sinking into the soft earth, clutching the small gifts they had prepared, the embroidered handkerchief, the tin of cookies, a handful of paper flowers twisted from scraps of newspaper. Their eyes darted toward the porch, searching instinctively for the bride and groom they had convinced themselves must exist. Helene whispered to Annika Weber, her voice low and uncertain. "Maybe the ceremony already happened. Maybe we're only here for the reception." Annika nodded quickly, though her brow furrowed. Something about the scene, the laughter, the casualness, did not fit the solemn formality of a wedding. But before either could question it, Mrs. Whitaker gestured warmly toward the yard. "Come," she said, her voice lilting with hospitality. "Everyone's hungry. Let's eat before the food gets cold." The women followed, and then stopped dead. Before them stretched a long line of tables draped with white cloths that fluttered in the soft spring wind. The sight robbed the breath from their lungs. There at the center glistened an enormous roasted ham, its brown glaze shining in the noon light. Bowls of mashed potatoes steamed beside piles of green beans and corn. Fresh loaves of bread sat in woven baskets. There was butter, real butter, yellow, thick, and plentiful, and pitchers of milk and lemonade beating with condensation. 3 pies waited at the far end, their golden crusts cracked open to reveal cherries, apples, pecans. Helene's heart stuttered. Even in the best of times in Germany, before the bombings, before hunger, such a spread would have marked only the grandest of occasions: a christening, a harvest, a wedding. Here, under the clean American sun, it looked like a banquet fit for kings. This, she thought, must be a wedding. What else could it be? Clara Weiss stepped forward, her English formal but trembling. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, holding out the small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Please, we bring a gift for the bride and groom. We wish them happiness in their marriage." The older woman froze. For a heartbeat, confusion clouded her kind expression. She looked toward her husband, who had been shaking hands with a few ranchers nearby. Samuel Whitaker turned, puzzled. "Bride and groom?" he repeated, brows knitting. "Ma'am, I don't rightly know what you mean. There's no wedding here today." The words landed like stones dropped in still water. A murmur rippled through the German women. Helene blinked, uncertain if she had misunderstood the language. Annika leaned close, whispering in German, "Maybe we got the day wrong. Next week, perhaps." But Helene saw the honest confusion in the faces around them. Not the secret amusement of people hiding a surprise, but genuine misunderstanding. "You invited us to Sunday dinner," Helene said carefully, switching to English she had practiced in the barracks. "Such food, such preparation. In Germany, this would be for a wedding or a most important festival. We thought someone was marrying." A slow realization softened Clara Whitaker's face. Her hand lifted to her heart and she gave a small, sympathetic laugh. "Oh, my dears," she said gently. "No, no wedding. This," she gestured toward the overflowing tables, "this is just Sunday dinner. We do this every week after church. Friends, neighbors, family. You're our guest today, that's all." The sentence hung in the air. Every week. The words struck harder than any reprimand. Lotte Schneider still clutched the tin of cookies she had saved rations for, her knuckles white. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper in German. "They eat like this every Sunday?" No anger, only stunned disbelief, and a quiet grief that such abundance could exist anywhere while Europe starved. Clara Whitaker seemed to sense the shift, the tremor of realization passing through her guests. Without further comment, she smiled again, not to dismiss their feelings, but to welcome them beyond the shock. "Well," she said softly, "it wouldn't be a proper Sunday if our neighbors didn't eat together. Come sit, please. You're part of it now." One by one, the German women obeyed, taking their seats among ranchers and families who offered them shy nods and hesitant smiles. Helene found herself beside a young man with tanned skin and bright, unguarded eyes. "Name's Daniel Whitaker," he said with an easy grin. "Ma says you helped her with the gift. You sew real fine." Helene blushed, unsure how to reply. She only nodded and managed a small "Danke." When Mr. Whitaker stood to say grace, every head bowed. The moment was quiet, reverent, and, for the first time in years, Helene felt something stir inside her that she hadn't dared to feel since before the war. Peace. As the meal began, plates filled, laughter rose, and the invisible wall between enemies began to crack. Not with speeches, not with politics, but with the passing of bread, the sharing of sweetness, and the realization that kindness could exist even across the wreckage of war. "This is what we do every Sunday after church," said Clara Whitaker, her tone gentle and matter-of-fact. "Friends, family, neighbors, we gather, eat, talk. It's our way of ending the week." Her words drifted through the spring air like something from another world. The idea of such abundance and of food and laughter as routine, not luxury, seemed almost impossible to grasp. Helene Vogt stared at the spread before her, the roasted ham, the pies, the thick slices of butter softening in the sun. The embroidered handkerchief she still held suddenly felt absurdly fragile in her hands. The small token of imagined celebration now seemed childish beside this effortless wealth. Around her, the other women shifted uneasily. Their faces held not shame, but something deeper, a wordless recognition of distance, not just between two nations, but between two realities. Lotta Schneider, who still cradled her tin of cookies, whispered in German, "They eat like this. Every week?" Her voice was hollow with disbelief. "Every Sunday while we—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. The sentence trailed into the air as heavy as grief. Clara Whitaker caught the change in atmosphere immediately. She didn't try to explain or soften it further. Instead, she simply extended her arm toward the long tables and said warmly, "Please, come sit. Wedding or not, we're glad you're here." Her kindness broke the tension. Slowly, the German women took their seats among the American families. Children peeked curiously from behind their mothers' skirts, while ranchers offered awkward nods and hesitant smiles. There was a cautious stillness at first, as though no one knew what to say or how to act. Helene sat between Annika Weber and a young man who introduced himself as Daniel Whitaker, the Whitakers' eldest son. His handshake was firm but shy, his palms rough with years of work. "You helped my ma with that embroidery, didn't you?" he said, glancing at the small wrapped parcel still on the table. "She says it's real fine." Helene smiled faintly, uncertain how to respond. "Danke," she whispered. At the head of the table, Samuel Whitaker rose, removing his hat. "Let's give thanks," he said simply. Everyone fell silent. The Americans bowed their heads, and after a moment's hesitation, so did the German women. The prayer was short, a few quiet sentences of gratitude for the meal, the company, and the end of another week of safety. When the blessing ended, the scraping of chairs filled the air. Platters passed hand to hand. Butter spread over warm bread. The German women watched as generous portions were heaped onto their plates. Thick slices of ham, piles of potatoes, bright green beans, golden cornbread. Helene took her first bite. The flavor was overwhelming, rich, smoky, tender in a way that made her chest tighten. It wasn't just the taste of food. It was the memory of what life used to feel like. She chewed slowly, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. For a while, no one spoke. There was only the sound of forks, the murmur of small talk, the rhythmic laughter of children chasing each other between the tables. Then softly, Annika broke the silence. "How is it possible?" she asked in careful English. "Such food every week? Even with the war?" Clara paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. She set it down, folding her hands. "The war's touched us too," she said quietly. "We've lost sons, brothers, friends. We ration sugar, coffee, gasoline. But the fighting hasn't come here." Her gaze drifted toward the mountains, distant and peaceful under the sun. "No bombs, no soldiers on our streets. We're lucky. Luckier than we deserve, maybe." Her words landed softly, but they carried the weight of truth. The German women listened in silence, understanding more in tone than in words. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice uncertain. "My brother's over there now," he said. "Europe. We haven't heard from him in weeks." He looked toward Helene as he spoke, as though trying to bridge something unseen. "He's with Patton's army somewhere in Germany. We just keep praying he'll come home." Helene felt her chest tighten. Without thinking, she answered in halting English, "My brother, Klaus, he fought on Eastern Front. He died at Stalingrad. 19 years old." The table quieted. Daniel met her gaze, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Two strangers from opposite sides of the world, bound by the same loss. He nodded slowly. "Then you know," he said softly. Helene swallowed hard. "Yes," she whispered. "I know." The conversation spread outward, carried by hesitant words and gestures. Greta Hoffman spoke with an older rancher named Frank Miller, who gestured as he talked, trying to explain his cattle business. Greta laughed, a small, uncertain laugh, and mimed milking a cow. The rancher grinned, nodding. Across the table, Lotta offered one of her cookies to a young girl, who accepted it shyly and then handed her a slice of pie in return. Bit by bit, the tension dissolved. English blended with German, laughter with silence. Even those who couldn't understand each other's words found understanding in tone, in kindness, in shared grief, in something human that no language could divide. As the meal drew on, the air filled with the smell of coffee and the hum of soft conversation. The war, for that single afternoon, seemed impossibly distant. Helene looked up from her plate toward the Whitaker farmhouse, sunlight glinting off its white walls. It looked like something from a dream, a place untouched by fear or hunger, and for the first time since her capture, she realized she wasn't thinking about escape or survival. She was thinking about life. The meal ended with laughter, hesitant, honest laughter that felt like a kind of surrender. And when Clara Whitaker brought out the last of the pies, Helene found herself smiling without guilt for the first time in years. Daniel spoke easily once the meal settled into its gentle rhythm. He told Helene Vogt about his family's ranch, the long winters that froze the troughs solid, the summers that burned the fields dry. He spoke of calves born too early, storms that stripped the wheat clean, and neighbors who showed up without being asked when fences needed mending. His words painted a life of hardship but not despair. It was the kind of struggle Helene understood. She listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When he mentioned his daughter, Clara, who was studying to be a teacher in Denver, Helene smiled softly. "My sister," she said in careful English, "she was to be a teacher too, before—" She hesitated, searching for the right phrase. "Before the sirens came." Daniel nodded, understanding what she meant without her finishing. "War doesn't ask permission," he said simply. All around them, similar exchanges filled the air, awkward at first, then slowly warmer. The American ranchers spoke of weather, crops, and family. The German women spoke of small towns, of markets and gardens that no longer existed, of brothers and fathers who had not come home. The conversations weren't political. They were human. For Helene, it was startling. The propaganda of her youth had drawn Americans as soft, selfish, untested by sacrifice. Yet the people around her bore the same marks of work and endurance as anyone in Europe. Their hands were calloused, their laughter weary, their sense of duty as solid as the earth beneath their boots. It struck her then. Values like work, honor, and family were not the property of any flag. They lived wherever people kept going in the face of loss. When Clara Whitaker returned with the pies, apple, cherry, and pecan, the mood had softened completely. The women leaned forward in awe at the sight of the glossy crusts, the smell of cinnamon and butter. Annika Weber accepted a slice of apple pie and took a tentative bite. Her eyes closed. "My grandmother," she murmured, "made apple kuchen, not like this, but the taste." She smiled through the ache of memory. "It brings her back to me." Clara's face warmed with understanding. Food has a way of doing that, doesn't it? It reminds us who we are, even when home feels far away. The simplicity of the word struck Helene deeply. She realized that for all the differences between them, language, uniform, allegiance, every person at that table carried the same longing, the wish to feel at home again. As the afternoon sun sank lower, children began to drift in from nearby farms, laughing and chasing each other through the yard. Their bright voices echoed off the barns, carrying a sound so foreign to the prisoners that it felt sacred. One small girl, no older than 5, wandered up to Helene and held out a crumpled dandelion with solemn pride. Helene accepted it with both hands, smiling. "Danke," she whispered, tucking it behind her ear. The child giggled and ran back to her mother, her braids bouncing with every step. The simple gesture hit harder than words, innocence unbroken by war. Later, as plates were cleared and coffee was poured, Samuel Whitaker stood, his expression thoughtful. He raised his hand for quiet. "Ladies," he began, his deep voice steady, "there's something I want to say before the day ends." The hum of conversation faded. Even the wind seemed to hush. "Some folks in town," he continued, "don't understand why we opened our gate today. They ask why we'd invite enemy prisoners to our table." He paused, glancing at his wife, who met his eyes with quiet encouragement. "But the truth is, my Sarah and I, we don't see enemies when we look at you. We see people, far from home, caught in something bigger than all of us." He looked around the table, his gaze gentle. "You didn't start this war, and neither did we. But maybe we can end a little piece of it right here, by being decent to each other. That's all this was ever meant to be, and a meal between neighbors." His words lingered, simple yet profound. The German women sat in silence, some blinking rapidly, others looking down at their hands. Helene felt her throat tighten. For months, she had armored herself with discipline and disbelief, but now the wall inside her began to crumble. Around her, others wept quietly, not from sorrow alone, but from the shock of being treated as human again. The sun dipped low, painting the yard in a warm golden haze. When the trucks arrived to take them back to Camp Haven, no one wanted to rise. Children waved from the porch, Mrs. Whitaker pressed small bundles of leftover bread and pie into the women's hands. "For later," she said, smiling softly. "In case the road feels long." Helene met her eyes, uncertain how to thank her. Finally, she simply said, "You have given us more than food." The drive back was silent except for the rattle of the truck and the distant sound of cattle bells. Each woman sat lost in her thoughts, holding on to her own piece of the day, the laughter, the taste of pie, the way the air had felt lighter for a few short hours. That night, in the dim barracks, the stories replayed in whispers. The misunderstanding about the wedding had turned to laughter, gentle and healing. But beneath that laughter lay something deeper, a quiet understanding that what they had witnessed was not luxury, but freedom. Helene sat on her bunk, pulling out the small notebook she had kept since capture. She dated the page and began her letter home, April 15, 1945. "My dearest mother, today I sat at an American table. There was bread and meat and laughter. For a few hours I forgot that I was a prisoner. They do not hate us here. Perhaps kindness survives even where reason fails. If this letter reaches you, tell Anna that people across the ocean still bake apple pies, and somehow they remember how to smile." She paused, staring at the paper as the camp lights flickered. Then she added softly, almost to herself, "Maybe peace begins with dinner." "Dear Mutter," she began in German, her handwriting small and neat to save every inch of paper. "Today I attended what I believed was a wedding. We spent days preparing, sewing, mending, creating small gifts, convinced that the Americans were inviting us to honor a bride and groom. You can imagine our embarrassment when we learned it was not a wedding at all, but simply what they call Sunday dinner. And Mutter, the abundance, a roasted ham larger than any I've ever seen, fresh bread with real butter, vegetables, fruits, and 3 kinds of pie." She paused, pen trembling above the page. Her next words carried risk if ever intercepted, but she could not stay silent. "We were told Americans were soft, spoiled, incapable of sacrifice. But the people I met today, they are not weak. They work hard. They cherish their families. They fear for their sons the same way we feared for Klausa." Her eyes blurred at the name. Their grief feels like ours, only spoken in a different tongue. She thought of Daniel, the rancher's son, his hands scarred from years of labor, his eyes shadowed by worry. "He told me of his brother," she wrote softly, "fighting now in Germany. Perhaps even near Stalingrad where Klausa fell. It's strange to imagine them so close. Strangers fighting for different flags, yet sharing the same cold, the same fear." She hesitated, knowing she was writing something dangerous. Maybe, Mutter, our enemies were never the people themselves, but the orders they obeyed. Weeks passed after that Sunday, but something within Camp Haven had changed. The laughter of that day still echoed faintly in the air, breaking the monotony of confinement. Then one Tuesday morning, Thomas Whitaker, the rancher who'd hosted the dinner, arrived at Captain Morrison's office. Hat in hand, he made a simple request: help. The ranches needed workers for spring planting. The men were overseas and the land was too vast for the few hands left behind. Could the women help? It was an unusual proposal, but not without precedent. Male German POWs across America were already working in fields, factories, and mills, helping feed the nation while war raged oceans away. The women of Camp Haven had been orderly, disciplined, and compliant, but restless. Most spent their days sewing, scrubbing, or waiting, time heavy on their shoulders. Morrison understood that giving them purpose might ease the strain on both sides. After careful thought, she agreed. 10 women were chosen, among them Helene, Annika, Greta, and 2 others, Liesel and Ingrid. When the truck came that first morning, they climbed aboard in their worn uniforms, hearts fluttering between anxiety and hope. None knew what to expect, work, kindness, or humiliation, but all knew it was something beyond the fences. As the vehicle rumbled toward the Whitaker Ranch, spring light spilled over endless plains, and for the first time in months, the horizon looked open again. Sarah Whitaker stood waiting when they arrived. Her smile was warm, steady, the kind that needed no translation. "We start in the garden," she said kindly, handing out gloves and simple cotton dresses to wear over their uniforms. Nothing fancy, just to keep the dirt off. The work was real, turning soil, mending fences, cleaning barns, hauling feed, but it carried a strange satisfaction. For women who'd been treated as ghosts of war, this labor made them feel alive again. Their muscles ached, Their palms split and bled, but each night they returned to camp exhausted and changed. The hours in the open air, the scent of horses, the rhythm of honest work all began to replace the numbness of captivity. Sometimes when Sarah handed them cool water at noon, Helene caught her watching with quiet pride, not as a warden might, but as one woman recognizing another's strength. Daniel appeared often, supposedly to help his father, though it was clear he came to see them. He spoke broken German now, a few words poorly pronounced but earnest. "Guten Morgen," he'd call out, his grin lopsided. The women laughed, answering in halting English. The exchanges were awkward, yet healing. Bits of humanity traded back and forth across the ruins of war. For the first time since her capture, Helene found herself smiling without guilt. She realized that something profound had shifted, not just in how she saw her captors, but in how she saw herself. She was no longer only a prisoner or an enemy. She was simply a person, a worker, a woman, a survivor. They had grown used to the rhythm of work, dawn light spilling over the horizon, the steady creak of wagons, the chatter of English words half understood. Their bodies ached each evening, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from purpose. The women were no longer just prisoners of war. They were farmhands, helpers, guests who laughed freely for the first time in years. More than labor, it was belonging that took root among the rows of planted crops and the scent of hay. For the first time, the fences of Camp Haven felt less like walls. Daniel Whitaker began visiting more often. His father said it was for the heavier tasks, mending posts, hauling feed, but everyone knew better. He lingered near the women as they worked, his attempts at German awkward but endearing. "Guten Morgen, Fräulein," he'd say, his grin wide as their laughter filled the air. In return, they practiced their English, correcting each other, teasing, learning. Between the broken words, understanding began to grow, shy and slow but real. Helene found herself waiting for those visits, her guard softening more than she ever expected. One afternoon, they worked side by side, mending a fence under the wide Colorado sky. The only sounds were the steady rasp of wire and the wind moving through dry grass. Then Daniel spoke, his voice low. "Got a letter from my brother yesterday," he said. "He's in Bavaria. Says the fighting's over there. The Germans are laying down their arms. Says he met some who just want to go home." Helene paused, her hand stilling. "I'm glad he's safe," she said quietly. And for the first time, she meant it without hesitation. The news came days later, May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The announcement crackled over the camp radio like a lightning strike. Across the United States, church bells rang. Parades filled the streets and people wept with joy. But at Camp Haven, celebration came mixed with silence. For the American guards, it was victory. For the women, it was the end of everything, and the beginning of something unknown. Helene sat on her bunk that night, the sounds of distant laughter drifting through the barracks. No one spoke. Every woman was lost in her own storm of thoughts. The war was over. That meant one thing, repatriation. They would soon be sent home to Germany. But what home? Rumors painted a grim picture. Cities bombed to ashes, borders redrawn by conquerors, families scattered or gone. Letters had stopped months ago. Entire streets had vanished. The Germany they knew no longer existed, replaced by hunger, rubble, and guilt. Helene stared at the ceiling, her heart heavy with questions she dared not speak aloud. What awaited them beyond the ocean? A ruined homeland? Or nothing at all? Annika sat beside her, tears glinting in the candlelight. "I don't know if my family's alive," she whispered. "I don't even know which side of Germany Hamburg belongs to now." Her voice trembled as she looked to Helene. "What are we going home to?" But there was no answer. Just silence, broken by the hum of the radio still whispering news of surrender and celebration. Two words that did not belong together in their world. Weeks passed. The camp filled with rumors and restless anticipation. The women packed and repacked their few belongings, each night stretching longer than the one before. Then, in early June, Captain Morrison gathered them in the mess hall. Her tone was formal, but not without empathy. "You will be repatriated within 8 weeks," she said. "You'll be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe and released to make your way home. Conditions will be difficult, but will ensure your safety until then." Her words were efficient, but her eyes held something gentler, almost sorrowful. That night, the barracks felt heavier than ever. Helene couldn't sleep. She lay awake thinking of the land she had left behind, and the new one that had, against all logic, started to feel like home. She thought of Sarah Whitaker's patient kindness, of the wide fields under the evening sun, and of Daniel's awkward smile as he tried to speak her name. What awaited her back in Germany was a grave, not a life. Here, in this place of supposed enemies, she had found purpose and peace. The thought of leaving felt like tearing away a piece of herself. Helene Krauss often lay awake through the long desert nights, staring at the corrugated ceiling of the barracks, torn between guilt and longing. Staying in America felt like betrayal, but returning to the ruins of Germany felt like walking into a ghost town of memories. Each night the question circled endlessly. Where do I belong now? It was during one of those golden April mornings at the Whitaker Ranch when Sarah approached her. The older woman's hands were dusty from kneading bread, her apron still dusted with flour. "Helene," she said softly, her eyes kind but steady, "Thomas and I have been talking. If you decide to stay here, we'd be proud to sponsor you." The offer hung in the air like the scent of warm bread. Helene froze, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Sponsorship meant freedom, a new life, and a chance to belong. She looked at Sarah's face, searching for pity and finding none. Only sincerity. Gratitude rose in her throat so thick she couldn't speak. All she managed was a trembling nod before turning away, tears burning her eyes. 7 years later, June 1952, sunlight spilled across the Whitaker Ranch like a benediction. White ribbons fluttered along the porch rails and wildflowers filled every vase Sarah could find. The air buzzed with laughter, the murmur of neighbors and the sweet scent of freshly cut hay. It was a day of celebration, this time a real one. Inside the old farmhouse, Helene stood before a mirror that had seen decades of life. Her reflection seemed almost unreal. The white gown, soft lace draped over her shoulders, the veil trembling with her breath. The dress had once been Sarah Whitaker's, altered lovingly to fit Helene's smaller frame. Behind her, Annika Roth adjusted the veil with careful precision, her nurse's hands as steady as ever. "You look radiant," she said in perfect English, smiling through eyes that still held traces of the past. "Daniel won't believe it's really happening." Helene laughed softly, her accent still curling her words. "Neither do I." She touched the simple gold band pinned to her dress, her engagement ring, and felt a surge of emotion she couldn't name. It had been Daniel's mother who first noticed the way the young rancher looked at Helene when she worked in the garden. His kindness had been unassuming, steady, patient, never pushing her faster than she was ready to go. He'd learned to speak German clumsily, not for amusement, but to make her feel understood. Over time, friendship had turned into something deeper, something neither war nor guilt could erase. Outside, the townsfolk gathered, ranchers, their wives, children chasing each other through the grass. It was a scene that might have come from a dream, so far removed from the gray barracks and barbed wire of Fort Bliss that Helene sometimes wondered if she'd imagined those years. When Thomas Whitaker appeared at the door in his Sunday suit, his weathered face soft with emotion, Helene felt her throat tighten. "Ready, darlin'?" he asked, his Texas drawl slow and warm. She slipped her hand into his arm. "More than ready," she whispered. As they stepped outside, the sunlight caught her veil, scattering it like a halo. The guests rose as one, the sound of murmured admiration blending with the soft rustle of the wind through the cottonwoods. At the end of the aisle stood Daniel Whitaker, waiting, the same easy smile on his face, the same steady warmth in his eyes. Helene's steps were slow, deliberate. Every face she passed was familiar. The same neighbors who had once watched her through cautious eyes now smiled with genuine affection. Annika sat in the front row beside her American husband, and scattered among the crowd were other women who had once worn gray uniforms, now dressed in bright summer colors. Each had built a new life from the ashes of their past. When Helene reached the altar, Daniel's eyes were glassy with tears. "You came a long way from that Sunday dinner," he whispered. She smiled through her veil. "Yes," she said. "And this time I know it really is a wedding." Laughter rippled softly through the guests. The ceremony was brief, unadorned, yet it carried the weight of years, of forgiveness, of survival, of the quiet rebuilding of lives torn apart by war. When the minister finally pronounced them husband and wife, the applause broke like a wave echoing across the fields. Afterward, tables were set up beneath the open sky, just as they had been that first Sunday years before. And at the center of it all, glistening beneath the sun, was a great roasted ham. The same scent, the same warmth, but now its meaning had changed completely. Helene stood beside Daniel, her hand in his, watching the children run through the yard, the women laughing, the men raising glasses in cheer. Sarah placed a plate in front of her, sliced ham, buttered bread, apple pie, and smiled knowingly. "Looks familiar, doesn't it?" she said. Helene nodded, emotion catching in her throat. "Yes, but this time, I understand. The food, the laughter, the sunlight. It all carried the same abundance that had once stunned her into silence. But now it wasn't excess. It was generosity. The kind that heals without asking for anything in return. As evening settled and lanterns were lit along the porch, Helene leaned against Daniel's shoulder, watching the horizon glow orange over the fields. "You know," she murmured, "I used to think roast ham meant a wedding feast." Daniel smiled, his arm wrapping around her. "Guess it did, in a way." Helene laughed softly, closing her eyes against the warm breeze. Somewhere behind her, someone began to play an old fiddle tune, and the sound drifted across the ranch like memory and promise intertwined. For the first time in years, Helene Krauss felt whole, not as a prisoner or a foreigner, but simply as a woman who had found her place in the world.